Hi, this is Bill, and this is Progpaganda. I've been a fan of progressive rock for the last 50 years or so, and there have been many times over the years where people who are being exposed to the genre for the first time have taken me aside and said, "This is really interesting stuff, but where did it all come from? Where did prog rock get its start?" There are people out there who think that the genre started with a big bang in October of 1969 with the release of a single album, King Crimson's debut in the Court of the Crimson King. But it wasn't the start of prog rock per se. There were quite a few things that happened in the 1960s, both artistically and in the music business, that helped prog rock to emerge in the manner that we now know it. In this series, I'm going to go over a bit of that history, and I'll discuss 25 albums that are very significant to the emergence of prog rock. In my opinion, prog rock might have become a very different animal from the one we've come to know and love had these albums not been created over the course of the years 1965 through 1969. Just a quick recap of the criteria that we used to select the albums that comprise the 25 proto-prog albums that shaped prog rock. First off, we selected albums based on their influence. It could be based on the artist's innovation, based on cultural influence, or the use of technology. We restricted ourselves to a single entry per artist on the list in order to promote diversity of the music of the time and to make sure that certain artists that had tremendous commercial appeal at the time didn't dominate the list. Today's entry is the self-titled first album by the Yardbirds, an album which over the years has also come to be known by the title Roger the Engineer, referring to the cartoon on the front cover of a recording engineer drawn by the band's rhythm guitar player, Chris Drija. Even people who don't know the Yardbirds' music well are familiar with the band through their three great lead guitar players that came through the band's ranks throughout their initial tenure. Eric Clapton was with the Yardbirds from 1963 into 1965 and played with the band on their first big hit, For Your Love. Jeff Beck replaced Clapton in 1965 and remained with the Yardbirds for a little over a year, playing on most of the band's well-known hits. Near the end of Beck's tenure, Jimmy Page joined the band, initially as a bass player, but soon was working with Beck in a dual lead guitar role. Beck ultimately left the Yardbirds in November of 1966, with Page at that point remaining as the band's sole lead guitar player until the band came to the end of its initial run in mid-1968, at which point Page would use the Yardbirds' name as something of a jumping-off point to form his next band, which of course ultimately became known as Led Zeppelin. The Yardbirds in 1963 were predominantly a blues band. The highlight of the Yardbirds' early history was the fact that they had a long-standing residency at a popular London club called the Crawdaddy, which prior to the Yardbirds being featured there was the London home of the Rolling Stones before they reached their first wave of popularity. The manager of the Crawdaddy Club, Giorgio Gamelski, not only hired the Yardbirds to play at his club, he became their manager, and ultimately, once the Yardbirds secured a recording contract, he became at least their titular record producer. Gamelski, I think, largely took the role or the title of record producer in order to claim the typical 1% royalty that went with records at the time. The actual production in the studio was done by the Yardbirds bass player, Paul Samwell Smith, who was a gifted player and gifted producer. We'll talk a little bit about that in a moment or two. Gomelsky recognized fairly early on with the Yardbirds that they were something very special on stage. They incorporated a significant amount of improvisation in their live work, including double time sections to lengthen many of their songs on stage that became known as rave-ups. And Gomelsky wanted to take advantage of the band's special qualities on stage fairly early on by insisting that their first album release be a live album, which was a rather unusual move for a new band, especially given the time frame in 1964 when the album was recorded. But the Yardbirds' first album indeed would be the Five Live Yardbirds, which is even today looked at as a groundbreaking rock and roll live album. That said, it was not terribly successful, even in the band's native England. And given that the band's American record company, CBS Epic, declined release of it back in 1964, it wouldn't be until a number of years later that Five Live Yardbirds would be released in the United States in its original form, although some of the songs on it would be released in compilation albums that would come out to support the Yardbirds' initial American tour in 1965. Given the relative commercial disappointment that Five Live Yardbirds was, Gomelsky's next move with the band was to have them concentrate on singles releases. This was the conventional approach for rock bands in the 60s, of course, and the Yardbirds made some traction in the UK making singles. They were able to garner a fair amount of support both on BBC Radio and on the pirate radio stations of the day, as well as on BBC television on shows like, for example, the British series Ready, Steady, Go. But the commercial bent that the band was pursuing was not something that Eric Clapton in particular was very happy about. And Clapton ultimately got to the breaking point with Gomelsky's insisting that the Yardbirds perform a song from an outside songwriter called For Your Love. For Your Love is an excellent song. It was written by Graham Goldman, who, in addition to writing that and other songs for the Yardbirds, also wrote several songs for the Hollies as they were growing in popularity. And of course, Goldman himself in the 1970s would be one of the fronting musicians of the band 10cc. It was a great song. It was very well produced, features wonderful harpsichord work by another of Gomelsky's clients, the keyboard player Brian Auger. But it was not Clapton's cup of tea. Clapton wanted to play blues. He was a blues purist at this point in time. And the fact that the Yardbirds were getting away from their blues roots did not sit well with Clapton. Ultimately, after For Your Love was released, Clapton left the band. The Yardbirds very quickly enlisted the services of Jeff Beck at that point to replace him. Beck was much more experimental in his approach, at least at the time, to how he would make use of his guitar in the studio. He was an early adopter of effects pedals and various playing techniques that other more conventional players didn't pursue or didn't know how to pursue at the time. And that ultimately made the Yardbirds a very unique band with the singles that followed. Songs like, for example, Heart Full of Soul, Shapes of Things, Mr. You're a Better Man Than I, and The Train Kept a Rollin' all bear Beck's fingerprints all over them. and are still very popular tunes on classic rock radio today. Despite the success of these singles with Jeff Beck in the UK, however, the Yardbirds still hadn't been successful with breaking through to the North American market. Ultimately, the singles were popular enough that CBS Epic Records did underwrite a tour of the Yardbirds of the United States in late 1965. In order to support that tour, they compiled 2 albums from the various singles the band had recorded, as well as the 5 Live Yardbirds album, in order to create product that fans who went to these shows could purchase at the record store. That wasn't enough for the Yardbirds, though. The Yardbirds at this point wanted to go into the studio and make a true record album. Most of what they had recorded to this point were blues standards or songs from outside songwriters like Graham Gouldman. The Yardbirds wanted, at this point, to feature their own songs on a studio album and to have control of the entire process in the studio to the degree possible. This was not a notion that sat well with Giorgio Gomelsky, and after some wrestling with the band over the matter, Gomelsky was ultimately fired and was replaced by a new manager, Simon Napier Bell, who agreed to go forward with the album and negotiated with the band's record companies in order for the band to pursue the album as they envisioned it. Paul Samwell Smith, the Yardbirds bassist, was enlisted as the band's producer for the album that would become known as Roger the Engineer. Samwell Smith effectively produced most of the Yardbirds' earlier recordings, although he did not receive the producer credit on most of the earlier albums. There is a musical director credit given to Samwell Smith instead. In fact, he really was the man at the controls on the Yardbirds records up to this point and would continue to be on Roger the Engineer. The Yardbirds were given an entire week to make the Roger the Engineer album. This week was not just for recording, but also for songwriting. The band had written a couple of songs that they envisioned as being part of the album. One of those, Over, Under, Sideways, Down, came out as a single in advance of the album. But it was expected that the band would spend just 1 week in the studio to write whatever songs were required to flush out a full 12-song record album and record the album as well. As you would expect under those circumstances, quite a few of the songs were done in a single take. The recording was done at Advision Studios. Advision, of course, in a few years' time, would become known for the legendary recordings that were done there by acts like T-Rex, Yes, and Emerson, Lake and Palmer. In 1966, however, Advision was just becoming known as a studio for making popular music records. And as a result, they didn't have the greatest of equipment. Their best recording machine at the time was a 4-track. So between the limitations of the 4-track technology and the limitations of time, what you hear on Roger the Engineer, at least in my opinion, is rather amazing. This band was a tight band. They knew each other's strengths and played to their strengths and put together a terrific record as a result. The band includes a fair share of blues-oriented material in the album, which, of course, you would expect. The Yardbirds were masters at blues-oriented work. Some of the songs are classics of the blues rock genre of the mid-60s. The album opener, Lost Woman, is a song that played very well for the Yardbirds live and would also become very well known to American audiences a few years later in the hands of Joe Walsh and the James Gang, who would take the Yardbirds' rave-up approach a step or two further. The James Gang's renditions of Lost Woman would often go in excess of 15 minutes. Over, Under, Sideways, Down follows Lost Woman on the album. That song is pretty much a straight-ahead blues-oriented number. It's one that's not terribly original. The band admitted in subsequent years that the riff for the song was derived from the Bill Haley and the Comets tune, Rock Around the Clock. But it's nevertheless a fine tune that ultimately became known to American audiences, first as a single and then subsequently as a commercial jingle. It was used to advertise a frozen milkshake product called Great Shakes. Other songs on the album, like What Do You Want and Jeff's Boogie, were blues-oriented as well. Where the album becomes very unique is on the songs that don't follow a blues pattern. And in that regard, it's a very special record because, in essence, is one of the very first psychedelic albums. The Yardbirds went so far on certain songs, like, for example, Hot House, to make use of African tribal rhythms and other sounds that you typically didn't hear on rock and roll albums in 1966. Two other songs on the album, Still I'm Sad and Ever Since the World Began, feature vocals in the style of Gregorian chants. Again, not something that you would hear on a rock and roll album of the day. It was a very unique and really amazing record, again, considering the fact that it was conceived of and captured in a week's time. It's a record that if you haven't heard it, and especially if you're not all that familiar with the Yardbirds, is definitely one you should check out. So why is Roger the Engineer an album that is important to progressive rock? Well, there are several reasons. As I said, the album is one of the first psychedelic rock albums, and psychedelic rock in many ways was a forerunner of progressive rock in the sense that the genre allowed the artist to work outside of the rules and create songs that were not the conventional verse-chorus type structure. And clearly on some of the tunes that I mentioned a moment ago, the Yardbirds did exactly that. It is a self-produced album, which for a band's first album in the studio, typically that wouldn't have been allowed. Paul Samwell Smith was a masterful producer and deserves a significant amount of credit here. Shortly after the album was made, Samwell Smith would leave the Yardbirds, in fact, to pursue a career in music production. Most of Cat Stevens' 1970s work was produced by Samwell Smith. Other notable records like Carly Simon's Anticipation feature Samwell Smith as producer as well. So Paul Samwell Smith definitely made a mark as a music producer following his work with the Yardbirds. Last but not least, this is an album that features, in the greatest tradition of what would become progressive rock, two virtuosos who ran the show. One, of course, was Jeff Beck, who was performing at his very best, or certainly at his best up to that time on this album. The other is Paul Samwell Smith, who was a terrific bass player in his own right and was capable of creating very memorable bass lines. I mentioned the James Gang's version of Lost Woman earlier. The bass lines and pieces of you know, improvisation that the James Gang employ on their versions of Lost Woman come right from the Yardbirds recording. Their bass players at the time, Tom Criss and later Dale Peters, didn't tamper with perfection. They knew that they had something in their heads that worked and did not mess with the formula there. Beck, of course, would have a stellar career beyond the Yardbirds. Roger the Engineer was the last Yardbirds album on which Beck appeared. When Paul Samwell Smith left the Yardbirds shortly after Roger the Engineer was made, Jimmy Page would join the band as bass player, and Beck and Page subsequently would work for a while together as double lead guitar players within the Yardbirds before Beck would ultimately leave and pursue his solo career, which of course was tremendously varied, moving from rock, blues, jazz fusion, electronica, and all sorts of side projects and various sounds that he would employ and make great use of both in the studio and on stage until his untimely death in 2023. So yes, it's a record that's definitely worth hearing. Is it prog rock itself? A lot of people, I'm sure, will argue that it's not. But again, this is a record that features all the hallmarks of the prog rock genre in its own way. And it's another record on this list that helps to break the barriers down to allow progressive rock to become what it did a few years later. Well, there you have it. We'll be back soon to discuss the next artist on the list. In the meantime, if you have any thoughts or questions about this particular show, please feel free to share them in the comments. And please feel free to subscribe and keep track of upcoming shows as we go forward. Thanks very much. Take care.